The brutal killing of George Floyd triggered a national reckoning with racism unlike anything we've seen since the 60s. And it sparked new conversations about systemic racism and how we all need to be fighting to end it. Black racism was born 400 years ago when 12 million Africans were dehumanized and sold into slavery, and then continued with the terrorism of lynchings, the Tulsa Race Massacre, and Jim Crow segregation. And although the civil rights movement changed history by fighting for equality and justice, systemic racism, the kind that infiltrates institutions like banks, schools, and the law, is much more insidious. Let's look back and see how systemic racism became embedded in American society. Back in the 1930s, when Social Security was introduced, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers, and they accounted for 2/3 of Black Americans. This inequality forced many older Black Americans into poverty and homelessness. Between 1934 and 1962, the Federal Housing Authority underwrote $120 billion of home mortgages, and 98% of them went to white people. Federal policy said that Black neighborhoods were a bad risk and therefore not eligible for loans. Even the GI Bill excluded Black veterans from its beneficial housing provisions. Since then, house values have risen dramatically, giving white homeowners a huge bump in wealth from which Black people were excluded. Redlining was the system used by banks to determine which neighborhoods would get loans to buy homes. Black neighborhoods, outlined in red ink, were deemed the riskiest to invest in. Redlining made it impossible for Black people to get loans. Redlined areas also didn't have the tax base to fund good schools, healthcare systems, or transportation, causing safety concerns and subsequent over-policing, which seeded the problems we see today. Even now, predominantly white schools receive more than $20 billion more funding than districts that serve mostly students of color. And today, Black home ownership is at an all-time low, only 42% compared to 72% for whites. This generational history matters when we talk about the wealth gap because inheritances are very significant to current wealth, and family wealth takes generations to build. In the U.S., white families hold 90% of the national wealth, Latino families hold 2.3%, and Black families hold 2.6%. Racial pay inequities widen the gap. This year, the average white worker made 30% more than the typical Black worker. With the whole family's income, Black households earn 60% of the average white household. Lower incomes mean that the poverty rate for Black families is over twice that of white families. Black individuals are also twice as likely to be unemployed than white individuals. And even though the number of Black college graduates is growing, they're twice as likely to be unemployed as all other graduates. One U.S. study found that job resumes with traditionally white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than those with traditionally Black names. African Americans are still incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites, even though imprisonment rates have fallen in the past few years. Black inmates make up over 30% of prisons, yet only 12% of the country's population. And even though African Americans and whites use drugs at similar rates, the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, and once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to get lengthy prison sentences. Let's look at police stops. The Stanford University study analyzed more than 100 million traffic stops across America and found Black drivers are 20% more likely to be pulled over and more likely to be searched. In fact, in New York City, 88% of police stops in 2018 involved Black and Latino people, while 10% involved white people. Of those stops, 70% were completely innocent. A crisis like COVID highlights the inequalities in a society. Black people are dying of COVID at 3 times the rate of white people because of higher rates of underlying health conditions, higher density poor neighborhoods, more employed as frontline workers, and poorer access to testing and healthcare. So that's systemic racism. This awakening to injustice is our chance to make it right. Listen, learn, and act now.